Hey everybody, Happy New Year. This is Dawn Zoldi. I'm your host of the Full Tilt podcast, Tech Industry Leadership Talks. And what a great way to kick off the new year than with Glen Lynch, the CEO of Volatus Aerospace. Welcome to the show, Glen.
Hi, Dawn. Happy New Year.
Yes, absolutely. It's going to be a great one. And we're so excited to kick off this year with you, Glen. Just a little bit about Glen, everybody. If you haven't heard about Volatus Aerospace and you're in the drone industry in particular, I don't know where you've been. But, Glenn started that company just a couple years ago in 2019, and now it's this global presence. And Glenn has over 40 years of experience in aviation. So, Glenn, I'm not going to butcher your bio. I'm going to let you give a little bit more around the edges of that bio, and then we'll get into your theme for today and into the show.
Thanks, Dawn. Yeah, my background is actually coming up on 41 years in aviation and aerospace. That's pretty much all I've done. I hate to say that these days, but it seems like a big number. But I'm a professional pilot by training. So started out my life flying airplanes, teaching people to fly, flying business jets. Had the good fortune of flying some very, very sophisticated aircraft pretty much all over the world. But my first love right from the very beginning has always been business. And I've had the really good fortune of attracting some spectacularly talented people, especially to Volatus. And so a couple of years ago, I started paying attention to what was going on in the drone industry, and it just captivated my interest. So that's literally been my every waking hour since 2019, but it's been a lot of fun. A lot of work, but a lot of fun.
I'm going to get into your theme here in a second, but before we do, Glenn, I just want to share with everybody, I also created my company in 2019, P3 Tech Consulting, and Glenn was like one of the first people I spoke with that year, if I recall correctly, and we've kept in touch through the years, and I've just watched Volatus continue to bloom and grow. It's just been an amazing journey. But Glenn, you picked a really interesting theme that I want to pick your brain on for a second. So you picked for today, for this leadership, leading with an ESG mindset. So everybody, ESG is environmental, social, and governance. So Glenn, you picked this theme. So why did you pick it?
I would love to say it's because it's been a lifelong interest of mine, but in fact it hasn't. I started out like everybody else growing up in an era where, blue bins showed up and we started to learn about recycling, more about waste management. But as time has gone by, my children have taught me a lot. And then as we took our company public, ESG became an important topic. And it was actually Danielle Gagne, who heads up our marketing communication, that literally insisted that I had to pay attention to this. So I started trying to educate myself. And as I started reading and researching and learning, what caught my attention here was a couple of things. Our need as human beings to do better in taking care of our planet so that our grandchildren's grandchildren actually have an inhabitable place to live. And the second part was realizing that in addressing the problems that are causing the strain on our planet right now, there's literally billions of dollars of potential profit available. So doing good has the opportunity of not only being the right thing to do, but also generating tremendous profits. And finally, looking at the industry we're in and realizing, Dawn, that what you and I do every day in the drone space, we're ESG poster children. We just don't realize it, right? And it's become a major subject for us, both because I think it has the opportunity to do the right thing and also the opportunity to accelerate the success in our industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we hear so much, Glenn, about reducing carbon emissions and more so in the context of advanced aerial mobility. And, but drones are a huge part of that, that last mile delivery, the middle mile delivery, getting cars off the road. So many different facets to this that we're going to peel back as we kind of talk now. But you mentioned your children and grandchildren. I want to take you way back to your own childhood and talk a little bit about your upbringing. So first of all, where are you even from?
Well, I was born in Toronto, so I'm a big city guy by birth. Moved out to the country in my teen years, a place called Belleville, which is kind of halfway between Toronto and well, closer to Toronto than Montreal, but in the middle of the two of them. And kind of a middle class family with tremendous parents and a loving sister. And I had a great upbringing, but that's really where I came from.
So you mentioned that you got a love for aerospace and aviation maybe early in your life. Where did you get that kind of inspiration from?
Well, it was a few things. Believe it or not, I can tell you exactly when it happened. I was 12 years old. I was doing
Wow.
what many young, early teenagers do. I was babysitting. I saw a program on TV, and it was about learning to fly, and it just captured my imagination. I grabbed the Yellow Pages, which I know a lot of our millennials won't even know what a Yellow Pages was. That
I
makes me
know what
feel
it is.
older. But looked up the local airport. It was about 9 o'clock at night, and I dialed the phone number. I don't know what possessed me to do that, but this voice on the end of the phone just said airport, and that was the beginning of a relationship with a gentleman by the name of Jim Marker, who would actually take time from me for me regularly. Sometimes he wouldn't be able to do it, but most times just talking to me about aviation, about how to prepare myself and really motivated me. And then at the age of 15, the replica of the Spirit of St. Louis, which is a very historic piece of our aviation heritage, landed at our local airport. And I rode a bicycle out there and I met him. And long story short, 1 year later, I was learning to fly, working, paying for my education by literally riding a tractor, cutting grass, washing airplanes, handing the mechanics tools, anything that it took to do it, and that was the beginning of my aviation career. I actually
Wow.
learned to fly there, ended up running the flying school there, and that was the beginning.
That's amazing. So, just curious, you said you had a sister, you had loving parents. As you were on this early journey, like what was their reaction? It sounds like they didn't have this background in aerospace and aviation. You just like saw a TV commercial. What was their reaction when you said, "Hey, this is what I want to do"?
Well, I remember the first day sitting on I had just finished rototilling a garden, and my mother was bringing my father and I lunch. I was talking about the fact that I wanted to learn to fly. My mother said, that's not realistic. It's an expensive career. We're probably not going to be able to afford that. One of the few times my father shut my mother down and said, you know what, here's the way it goes. I can't tell you how you're going to get there. Your mother's right. It's going to be difficult, but if you want it bad enough, you'll do it. And literally, that was the beginning. But my father, on the flip side of that, my father was my very first student when I got my instructor rating. So he became a pilot, as did 2 out of 3 of my sons.
Wow, that's amazing. And when you think about ESG, right, environment, social, and governance, even back then, I mean, that's hard to do. We just talked about that for a second. We're going to talk about it more. But it sounds like, just kind of in a parallel world, you were like rolled up your sleeves and said, this is what has to be done. I'm just going to get it done. And how many jobs did you just say you did to put yourself through school? Like 5, I think I counted 5 in my brain really quickly
Yeah,
as you were talking.
yeah.
Wow. So that's amazing. Looking back, whether it was your mentor, this gentleman that, picked up the phone and then kind of continued mentoring you, or someone from your family, is there, as you look back, like one saying that you learned along the way that kind of resonated with you and helped kind of inform, your journey?
There's a book that I used to keep on my nightstand. It was called Successories. They may even still sell them today. But one of the phrases that was in there I had heard a few times around the airport, and it basically said some people see the world as it is and say why. Others see it as it could be and say why not. And then the line that came after that was dare to dream. And that's probably something I remember more than anything.
Wow, that's so just got chills there. And by the way, I think they definitely do sell those accessories. I know when I won that Women to Watch award, that was like part of my plaque from those folks. So they're still out there doing great things. But so let's talk about your education, because not only did you put yourself through flight training school, and I think we have a really cool photo here of you in a biplane. You know, so you did this, but you're also obviously getting your formal education at the same time along the way. Tell us a little bit about that, just kind of, middle school, high school, college, question mark, what was that kind of path?
So I had a normal upbringing in a public school system for public school and high school, and then I went straight from that into private aviation school. So I've done all of my education through private aviation schools, and then subsequently I fell in love with business. And most of my business education was either the School of Hard Knocks or taking courses at university courses in the evenings between jobs and so on. So most of my focus, I actually was so committed to aviation. I trained myself, or I went through training to become an airline transport license, which I still hold in Canada as an airline transport pilot, and an airline transport pilot full privilege license in the United States. So I hold basically top level licenses in both countries. And then I did a Class 1 flight instructor rating, which is the Canadian equivalent of a CFI. I was the trainer of trainers back then. So that was the primary education. But my focus shifted because the very first flying school that I operated, I was always intrigued with how we could do it better, how the business could do better, how we could create. If you didn't make any money, you didn't have the ability to do anything any better. And that was where my love for business happened. So, well, I've always been in aviation, and I consider myself to be a well-qualified professional pilot. But the truth of the matter is, my first love has never been aviation. It's always been business. It just happens that aviation was my field.
Wow. And, ESG is about that too. It's making things better. And it sounds like you've been kind of doing that along the way. Glenn, I want to real quick call out a couple folks that have been in the chat. Chris Geneseth and Dilip Nair both are saying Happy New Year. So, gentlemen, thanks so much for dialing in. Appreciate you. And everybody else out there, we are live. So if you have any comments, questions for Glenn, please feel free to drop them in and we'll kind of incorporate that into our talk here. But Glenn, I mean, you talked about the School of Hard Knocks, all of these private aviation schools, going through public school. Uh, is there any advice that you would give someone that has an interest in aviation, someone like you, if you could go back and talk to that 12-year-old Glenn, just like as you had a mentor do for you, what would you tell them?
Probably the same thing I tell my own children. I have 4 kids of my own and 6 grandchildren now. So that's a question that echoes regularly. I would say first thing, make the most of formal education while you can, remembering that no matter where you go in your life, whatever's between your ears belongs to you. The education, the learning, the experiences, those are assets you're going to be able to build on and benefit from your entire life. So that would be the most important thing is, make the most of your education while you can.
Yeah. So along the way, was there a particular professor or instructor or teacher that kind of stands out for you that as you again look back, you think this person was a real inspiration to me?
So interestingly enough, when I'm managing, and I've been a professional CEO now for about 36 years, so most of my life has been running businesses. So I often default to where I'm most comfortable and probably best trained, which is in a cockpit. So there was a flight instructor. He was actually my first instructor, a fellow by the name of Dave Pyle. He's long since gone, but he used to tell me the important thing in a cockpit, as in life, is to manage the here and now, look ahead, plan ahead, but don't get stuck with baggage. So the concept is, and I learned that in a cockpit, Not to say that pilots don't make periodic mistakes or something doesn't go wrong or whatever, but the most important thing is you just address whatever the thing is and you don't let yourself get stuck on something that was less than ideal. You know, if you use an example, if you touch down in an airplane and your landing is one of those thumps instead of the nice little chirps, you know, you still have an airplane that's moving along at 100+ knots that we need to get stopped, get it off the runway, and so on. So you simply don't let anything get stuck. You don't trip yourself up on yesterday. You simply learn from it and move forward and stay focused on what you're doing and where you're going. But that I learned that in a cockpit from Dave Pyle right in the very beginning of my flight training.
You know, and that's not just beautiful advice for a pilot, but it's just wonderful life advice, right? Glenn, I know you can relate to this. I was listening to the radio the other day and I heard Fleetwood Mac's, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. And, like what you just said, just kind of reminds me of some of those lyrics where I think, in today's world, so many young people with social media and everything else out there can really get hung up on like a little mistake that they blow way out of proportion and get, as you said, stuck, with the baggage and not move forward. So I think that's great advice, not just in the cockpit, but in life in general. So thank you for sharing that. So let's transition then. So you talked about business, how this was kind of your passion that you realized through aviation. Tell us a little bit about your early career. So you were an instructor pilot. Was that your full-time job, or did you jump into something else and do that on the side?
So I had multiple jobs going at the same time because the one thing is an aviation education is very expensive, and flight instructors don't make a lot of money. I certainly didn't back then. So you were working all the time, but it certainly became my full-time job very, very quickly. And I progressed from there. I moved from the small airport that I learned to fly at. I moved to Toronto, was involved in one of the largest flying schools in Canada. Um, then we grew. We actually acquired a company that was located back closer to where I grew up, and I was moved down there to integrate that company into our corporate culture. That put me involved me a lot in the corporate end of aviation. We were running Learjets and turboprops and those sorts of things. So that's when I moved into that space. And that was still in my early 20s. By the
Wow.
time I was 26, I ended up moving up to Ottawa, which is the nation's capital in Canada. And then I was hired to be the president of a business jet management company that was running 3 business jets and a couple of turboprops by the time we were done, doing charter work for business customers and government customers and the like. And it progressed from there. So I spent most of my career operating business jets, running maintenance, repair, overhaul facilities. I was involved in the United States. I was on the President's Council of the National Air Transport Association, NATA. So I was quite active in that industry. Spent a 10-year stint in manufacturing, a business that if you ever fly United Airlines and you fly in a CRJ 550, that's a 70-passenger airplane that was reconfigured for 50 passengers with a VIP style interior. That was actually designed and built by one of my companies. They've got about 74 of those aircraft in service. And that's around shortly after that was when I moved into the drone industry. Continued to actively fly right up until, when COVID hit, our drone business was really starting to accelerate. So I stepped out of a business jet cockpit and now I simply fly for myself.
I'm laughing, Glenn, because for everybody out there listening, if you've never seen Glenn's like slide deck of all of these businesses, it's very confusing. I remember the first time that you and I had met, you gave me the briefing, and I was like, "Holy shnikes! I can barely keep up with all of the different lines of effort." It's really interesting to me, Glenn, that as a crewed aviation pilot, you looked around and said, "Hey, drones should be something we get into." So tell me about that shift, because I mean, I think you of all people can appreciate, right? Or maybe agree. I'd love to hear if you disagree. I don't know that general aviation as a kind of general proposition is super welcoming of drones, at least right now. But here you were in that world, you looked around and said, I want to have a foot over there too. What what led you to that to that thought process?
I think it starts with the fact that my first passion is business, and my second passion would be aviation. I'm talking professional passions, but um, the problem in the crude aviation world, it's a very mature industry with very, very thin margins. It's a difficult industry. It's to do well financially. There's only a few companies that do exceptionally well. You can make a good living, but that's about it. Um, Drones, on the other hand, I paid attention to that, and it was actually my attention was drawn to that by an investment partner who's now our chairman, Ian McDougall. He was super intrigued by drones. I didn't really have any interest at the beginning. We decided to start a little, I'll say, avocation called Volatus Aerospace, put a little bit of money into it, and we were going to treat it like a business accelerator, incubator, help out a few small businesses, maybe invest in their company and help some entrepreneurs succeed. The very, very first entrepreneur, his name was Matt Johnson out of Winnipeg. We started looking at his business, and I was so intrigued. I was so impressed with Matt, who's still one of our rock stars today, but also so intrigued with the business opportunity that we bought that company and have bought 17 more since then. So uh, what I realized was there's a huge opportunity that was kind of coming from this maturing technology, right? In your world, where you came from in your military service, Don, with weapons of mass destruction and intelligence, so to speak. I won't say mass destruction. I would say targeted, air support type vehicles. Well, drones to me at the beginning were that. They were military tools, big
Yeah.
things, or they were consumer toys on the Best Buy shelves. But as the technology matured, I started realizing, we've got a different dynamic in human evolution. We're having fewer and fewer employees available to us. There's a whole bunch of new challenges coming as these technologies are evolving. And when we looked at the industry that was serving this exploding demand, we saw an awful lot of talent, but all small businesses. Nobody had any real capital resources. There was no national or international presence. And that's what we saw as the opportunity. And because in the crude aviation world, pilots, it's not something they do. It's someone they are. Flying an airplane for a pilot is part of their character, right? It's part of the fabric of their character. But for me, it was just a business. When I looked at and from an aviation standpoint, you look at drones and you go, well, they're not really airplanes. And when you're in the drone world, you don't really understand necessarily, although that's a pretty broad statement. You don't understand the drone industry at large doesn't understand crude aviation and the regulations, and they treated them very different, even from the standpoint that crude aviation was very analog. Drones are digital by design, and there was a lot of divisions. But the truth of the matter is, I often compare IFR flying, so instrument flying in a business jet, which is where I'm sitting in the cockpit and sometimes I can't see the ground, to beyond visual line of sight, where I'm operating a drone on the ground and I can't see the airplane. Other than that, they're both dealing with the you know, same physics. They deal with the same regulatory problems. They're not completely meshed yet, but I think what I saw was the roadmap that started to come from the convergence of these two industries. Drones are getting bigger. I mean, Volatus has a 19,000-pound drone on order from Nautilus out of San Diego, right? That's what would be more like a crewed airplane minus the crew.
Right.
And so that's really what got me excited about drones and how I transitioned to here. It's a tremendous opportunity.
I want to bring it back to your theme a little bit, Glenn, because you picked environmental, social, and governance. So let's foil that with what you kind of experienced in crude aviation versus the opportunities you see now as the CEO of Volatus in that ESG world. So you talked about the little blue recycle bins. I laugh because like we had those right in the military. Everybody in the federal government in the United States had one of those blue bins under their desk. And oh, make sure you turn the lights out before you leave. In the crewed aviation world, like what did you see, kind of as you progressed in your career along those lines, if anything, in the ESG world compared to kind of what you're seeing now in the drone world?
I would say again, I would be giving myself too much credit if I connected all of those dots back that early on. What I was seeing through most of my professional flying career was airframes that were becoming more efficient, aerodynamic designs that were becoming more efficient, and mostly engine OEMs that were creating more efficient power plants. We went from turbojet to turbofan, and then the turbofans just became incredibly high bypass technologies that were, really reducing fuel consumption. And but I think back in those days, that was more about operating cost and range than it was a conscious awareness of the harm that human beings are doing to the planet. And I think it wasn't until I really got into drones, and most specifically when we took our company public, that it really became a subject for me that I became, both interested in and also inspired by. I think it's critically important, but effectively, aircraft are getting better because they're reducing their fuel consumption. Air traffic control is coming up with more ways of reducing fuel burns by having more direct flight routings. Ground control, well, it doesn't seem like it these days when we're sitting waiting for our gates. The airports are trying to become more efficient at managing aircraft so that engines are running for a shorter period of time. And that's as much about the environment, maybe even more about the environment today than it is economic operating considerations. But we're still, as of 2017, dumping more than 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases into the environment every year. And about 10,000 pounds of that is pure carbon, 20% of which will still be in the atmosphere 10,000 years from now. So it's a topic that became huge for me. And segueing that into drones, drones are predominantly today green tech. We are either battery operated, hydrogen, which is up and coming, or hybrid, where you're dealing with, in some cases, 1/50th of the amount of fuel in a drone that we would be burning in a comparable mission on a crewed airplane or helicopter. And Volatus operates both, by the way. We're running crewed helicopters and fixed wing as well as drones. Drones still the majority, and we see that opportunity to transition these cleaner drone technologies and replace or supplement initially and eventually replace the helicopters and fixed wing with drones or eVTOLs, for example. That's a major issue for me, or a major interest for Volatus right now, is identifying an OEM that has an eVTOL technology that we can actually step up to the plate and buy to eventually be able to replace our helicopters in areas where drones won't have the regulatory authority to operate.
Glenn, it's so interesting because, you're talking about small drones all the way up to very large electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And it seems to me, as I kind of watch the industry for the smaller drones, the focus seems to be on the social aspect of ESG. I want to peel that back a little bit. And then for advanced air mobility, or the eVTOLs, it seems to be all about environmental. At least, again, this is a 30,000-foot view, me kind of looking out and seeing kind of what people are talking about. Governance is something we always yammer about just because it's like, hey, what are the rules? But, so let's talk about, because you've kind of seized on the environmental piece and those larger aircraft, right, that are very closely aligned with crewed aircraft in the world you came from and you grew up in. Let's talk about the social aspect of drones, because to me, I mean, Glenn, look, you just mentioned you had to have 5 different jobs to get yourself through pilot school, flight school. You don't need to do that, right? You can literally spend a couple $100, buy a drone, at least in the United States, take your Part 107 test. Maybe you take a course, maybe that's a couple $100, but maybe all in, maybe a couple grand at the most to like start your own business potentially. So that's what I kind of love about drones. The social, let's just say, accessibility and availability of different careers that maybe were otherwise unopen to people that had interest in aviation. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the social aspect of drones.
Absolutely. One thing I would wind off, just to close off the environmental side, is remembering that drones are smaller, they're quiet by
Yep.
comparison, which is much better from a wildlife perspective, which we actually experience, particularly in the pipeline integrity monitoring world right now. But on the social side, I think there's a lot to it. So we think of social, everything from respect and recognition for our indigenous peoples to an inclusive and diverse workforce. And I have to tell you, again, I think this is an area that the drone industry has excelled in from the beginning. I mean, Women in Drones is an organization that's hugely influential. And we've got a lot of very, very high powered, influential um, uh, executives that are from I hate to use the term, but an underrepresented demographic, right? Not just women, but just demographics in general. But I believe a lot of that also comes from the fact that the industry is driven by a lot of millennials who come literally, I think they were better um, tooled up for dealing with these subjects than my generation has been, for example. And I've learned a lot from them. And I like to think that I've grown in Volatus. What I like to point out is that the diversity and inclusion is not just about ticking an ESG box, because that's something we have to avoid this becoming a cliche, right?
Right.
It's realizing that when you've got a diverse workforce, a diverse and inclusive workforce and leadership, that you get a chance to see your customer base, your constituents through their eyes, right? As opposed to being, as my CFO has said, the pale, male, and stale, the old white guy calling it out, right? You see one perspective, but now we see the perspective of all of the demographics that we're serving, and we're more intelligent as an industry because of it. And I believe that it's a place that the drone industry started out strong, and again, something that we don't do enough to weave into our value proposition.
Well, I want to do a quick shout out, Glenn, to you and to Volatus and your leadership team. For those out there that don't know this, for the last year and now again for this year in 2023, Volatus has sponsored a whole host of companies on our other podcast, The Dawn of Drones, young companies, minority companies, up and coming companies, just as part of their ESG outreach and just to elevate the industry. And Glenn, I think that is so unique. You don't see a lot, like people talk the talk, but you actually walk it in elevating other companies that are not even part of Volatus, some of whom you didn't know last year. I remember because you kind of gave me carte blanche, like, all right, just pick who you want to be on the show. So I think that's amazing. And I can't say enough also about Women in Drones. And just real quick on that, I posted up, I forget what it was, dictionary.com picked woman as the word of the year. I had posted that, Glenn, on LinkedIn, and I actually got like some hate mail, which I was just like, are you kidding me? People like saying, for example, that I'm aligned with a particular kind of political thought process because, I'm one of those types. And it's just like, wow, okay, have you looked? Because I actually am a woman. And, I think it's important. First of all, and there's science behind this. Hello, everybody. Research. Diversity isn't political correctness. It is actually I can't speak right now, existential to the future of this industry. I know Vertical Flight Society has Mike Hirschberg has written an op-ed and they put out a paper on this too. Basically, if we don't have about 10,000 engineers in the next couple years, the eVTOL world is going to be in big trouble. And that means you have to inspire a lot of different people, not just one kind of person. But I'm going to get off that soapbox. Glenn, you've got some great questions here in the chat I want to address because we've got 10 minutes left, which is insane. And we are totally getting to the balance question because we are not ending the show without that for sure. So, Luis Alfonso Escobedo says, what are Volatus's plans for 2023? And what about drones for digital agriculture? I don't know if those are connected, if digital ag is in your 2023 plans, but Luis, thanks for the question. Glenn, what do you think?
So Louise, thank you very much. Those are great questions. So for Volatus, we started out by acquiring a bunch of companies that had complementary capabilities. And that gave us kind of a toe into most areas that the drone industry is actually functioning in. As time goes by, we start to look at the ones that are accelerating. So I would say those are, not to say that we're abandoning any other sections of commercial opportunity, but our primary focus is shifting towards large scale activities. So agriculture, I'll touch on that one first. That's probably one of the largest future opportunities for the drone industry. We have some unique challenges in that space right now, especially if you're talking about on the spray side, the pesticide, herbicide application side, because there's all kinds of complications there, which we're overcoming. Both our industry and the agriculture, the farmers are actually overcoming that. But digital ag is a big thing right now. Matt Johnson in Volatus, actually, the fellow I mentioned earlier, he heads up our digital ag and our educational programs, and he has created a program called SEER, which actually combines both of those things. So we're running a program now where we're educating students on operating drones, and they're flying over urban areas, collecting data sets and learning how to process those data sets using, I'll say, machine learning at this point, to be able to facilitate early detection of Dutch elm disease. So ultimately, that'll become a service that's capable of being rolled out to municipalities around the world, because it's not, right now it's Dutch elm, but it's not limited to Dutch elm. We're doing a lot of work in digital ag. I think there's as the world gets bigger, as our population grows, food production is more and more important, and I think this is going to be a huge area of growth going forward. Definitely an area of focus for Volatus. The other one is on large scale, I'll call them corridor inspection, asset management type activities. So right now, as anybody that's following the company has seen, the oil and gas industry is huge for us right now. We're doing an enormous amount of work with crewed aircraft and helicopters and drones in integrity monitoring for the pipeline industry. But our interest is really long linear inspections, corridor, airborne data collection for pipeline, power line, and rail. So that's another one. Public safety continues to be an area of growth. Infrastructure is another area of growth as we're continuing to see more and more use cases in those areas. And of course, defense. I think defense is going to be a big part of our drone world for many years to come right now. Those would be major areas of focus for us.
Okay, that's excellent. And we could have a whole podcast, Glenn, just about the work you all are doing with Ukraine. And, so hats off to you. I mean, we are not going to even skim the surface here in this podcast, by the way, everybody, on all the things Volatus is doing, not just from an ESG standpoint, but just kind of internationally in all the different ways they're making a huge difference in many, many lives, and frankly, saving lives. But I want to hit these two questions. I'm going to kind of combine them, Glenn. And then we're going to get to the balance question, because we're totally doing that. So let's see. Will Canada enable Part 135 style cargo with Nautilus faster than maybe the BV loss? And kind of along those lines, right? So we're talking about, last mile cargo. Do you see on-demand cargo or hub and spoke as being a faster model towards profitability for these larger kind of Nautilus-like aircraft? So I guess the first part is, do you think we're going to see like last mile cargo delivery before we even see BV loss in the United States? And then second, is it hub and spoke, or is it, on demand that you see as the wave of the future?
So I think there's a lot to unpack there.
There is. And
So
there's
I'm going to try and
questions
keep it.
keep rolling in, Glenn. They love
Yeah.
you here.
So I would say, first of all, we have to remember that there's a difference between what we're doing with beyond visual line of sight and basically what I'll say small UASs,
Yeah.
and what's happening with an aircraft that's 19,000 pounds that's actually going to have a Part 23 certification in the United States, for example. It'll be a certified unmanned aircraft. And the licensing that's coming out through ICAO right now is actually more of a cross between a BVLOS training and pilot crewed aviation training with an instrument rating. So it's not actually an instrument rating. They're all combined into one new license. So I think they're going to be handled differently. The large aircraft, that's really about replacing crewed aircraft. Like Nautilus was designed to replace, let's say, a Beech 1900. It carries 3 times the cargo and basically cuts the cost of transporting cargo by about 54%. It cuts the greenhouse gas or the carbon footprint in half just by virtue of its design and the fact that it's capable of carrying more cargo because it doesn't, first, it's got an interesting blended wing body, but also there's no accommodation for human beings on board. So that makes a lighter airplane, gives it more space. So that's where that one will fit. But I believe that they're somewhat separate. I think you're going to see more commercial cargo activity starting to develop. I think we're right on that edge. Certainly, DroneUp's doing a ton in that space.
They are.
In the urban, I would say, well, the urban delivery space. Our area is more, intra-island. You'll see more of that from us in the upcoming year, and more unique use cases where we can actually get approvals. I think that there's some companies that are doing some great things in Canada. One I'll make a mention of. They're not very well known. They're called Ribbit, like frog, ribbit, ribbit. Don,
Interesting.
hint, hint, wink, wink, somebody for you to interview. But they've actually developed a system that I've witnessed fly an ultralight aircraft, taxied out to the runway, take off, fly around a pattern, do an approach, land all on its own, and the pilot never touched the controls. They're working very, very closely with Transport Canada to be able to commercialize that technology. So I do think it's coming fast. Whether it comes faster in Canada versus the United States, I don't know. I like to think that we're trying to collaborate, across various governments, Transport Canada, FAA, and EASA. I'm hoping they're all going to get there around the same time, and we're just going to focus on which ones we can get done first, but they're all coming.
No, I totally agree, and I somewhat butchered those questions, and but Glenn, you actually answered them expertly. So the first one was really about non-last mile, but you did cover that with the bigger aircraft, and then also the Canadian versus U.S. timelines, and I think we're tracking very closely. What I would suggest to everybody is please join us on the Dawn of Drones. Mark your calendars now, the very end of the month. We're going to have Dean Attridge from Volatus on as our first Volatus Aerospace Above and Beyond guest. And so a lot of these questions I think would be perfect for that show. But I know Chris Geneseth had said questions about pipeline and inspection. So Chris, let's pause that one. Ask this to Dean in a couple of weeks because I cannot end this leadership show without asking Glenn about balance, because we've asked every guest so far, and it's so interesting to hear people's answers, Glenn. And I know we have some great pictures. In fact, 2 of them will roll, back to back here with you and your family. Tell us about balance. I mean, you're juggling multiple companies. You've become a worldwide presence. Business is your passion, but clearly family is too. How do you maintain first of all, let's ask who's in this photo?
Oh, this is my youngest son. I have a younger daughter, but that's my youngest son and his 2 daughters, my granddaughters, Everly and Aria.
Oh, so adorable. And I know we have one more photo. If we could roll that one too, Mike, since we're getting close to the end here. And tell
That's
us
the
about
same
this one.
son. Yeah, that was the same son. That's probably one of the proudest moments of my life. He graduated top cadet. At that point, he was a lieutenant in Canadian Forces. He's now a major serving in the American Forces as an exchange officer out of the 10th Mountain Division. But that day, he taught me about leadership. I had a guy my age walk up to me in a uniform, asked if I was the father of Lieutenant Lynch, shook my hand, and told me he could never imagine himself. He was a fellow that came up the hard way through the military, and was transitioning into officer training. Went through the program with my son and said he couldn't imagine following somebody the age of his son. And then he shook my hand and said, I would follow your son anywhere. And it
Wow.
was a super proud moment in my life. But I'm going to tell you honestly, Dawn, family is everything. And they're the most important thing in my life. I don't get enough time with them. Fortunately, I had a great Christmas with a lot of them here. But I will say that the balance, if anybody believes they have a perfect balance, they're probably kidding themselves. I believe that it's an everyday struggle, right? And it's a give and take. You've got to be prepared. Sometimes your professional career needs a little bit more of you. And when it takes something from you, it's also taking it from your family. You've got to find ways to recognize that and balance it. There is no perfect formula. It's an everyday struggle that's dependent on the individuals and their families. But if you lose that priority, as somebody that's actually took 3 wives before I got it right, um, you really want to think about that and invest in your families and make sure that you recognize that it is a struggle and you've got to continue to fight that fight.
Yeah, great words of wisdom there, Glenn. Could not agree more, honestly. Looking ahead to 2023, like you said, I'd be deluded to think I'm balanced. That's one of my goals, not a resolution. I don't believe in those. I'm just trying to have a little bit more balance in my life, and hopefully everybody out there as well. What are your priorities, and are you actually placing your time against those priorities? I don't know if you've ever done this before, Lynch, Glenn. I had done this, where you list these are the things that are important to me, and then you list, kind of what you're spending your time on. And for me, those lists were very upside down, and that was really kind of a sobering moment to realize that. And then of course recognizing it. What do you do about it? So Glenn, we are at the end of our show. We're actually a little bit over, but I want to take these last couple seconds to do 2 things. Number one, we're going to do our lightning round, 3 questions, super fast. So really quick answers, like 2-second answers. And then I'm going to ask you if you have any announcements before we close out the show. So lightning round, number 1, favorite book, go.
Avoiding Climate Disaster by Bill Gates,
All right, that's a great ESG book. Number 2, hero.
my father.
Aw. And number 3, the one leadership tip you learned along the way that you'd like to pass along to others.
I would say right now, I'd like to tie that in with ESG and say our planet is struggling. And not only do we have the power to make a difference, it's something that's essential for us to do. It's the right thing to do, and there's billions of dollars available for those who do it. So let's recognize that our industry is a poster child for ESG. Let's weave it into our value proposition as an industry. Make sure it's part of our story.
That's awesome. And I know, Glenn, you will not be at CES personally, but your team will be there. Looking forward to seeing some of the Volatus crew out there in Vegas this week. Any other real quick announcements, and how do people get in touch with you?
So I would say, first of all, I'm limited in what I can announce. Problem being a public company is unless I announce it to everybody, I can't announce it at all. So
Sure.
stay tuned. Please, if you're interested, subscribe to our investor relations site. We make regular announcements, and you can be at the front line of learning what's going on with Volatus. The other thing, I know there's some people that had questions for me. Please feel free to send me an email at g.lynch, L-Y-N-C-H, at volatusaerospace.com. And I'll do my best to get back to anybody. Love to hear from you. Love to talk to you. A rising tide, floats all boats. So I'm happy to work with anybody. And wishing everybody a happy new year.
Well, thank you, Glenn. And this was a crazily active chat today. So thank you, everybody out there, for joining us or for engaging with us and with Glenn. Definitely reach out to him. And don't normally do this, but I'm going to real quick say, we have a big year ahead, not only here on the Full Tilt and the Full Crew, our newscast, but on the Dawn of Drones. We've migrated over to AUVSI platform. So we'll be kicking that off tomorrow with Manuel Cogillo from Speedbird Aero and Yoav Amitai of L-Site. So check out that show. It's going to be dedicated New Year, New Tech. And I know, Glenn, you've got a lot of tech going on. And once again, Glenn and Volatus, the Above and Beyond series will be the last week of January with Dean Attridge on the show as well. So mark your calendars now, Wednesday, 9 a.m. Mountain, 11 a.m. Eastern. So that's all she wrote, everybody. Happy New Year. Thank you so much, Glenn. We are out here.